Hi, welcome back to Scott's Shelf. So today I'm going to talk about the book Flourish by Martin Seligman. So the topic of Flourish is positive psychology, and this is something that I'm interested in as an Unbeatable Mind coach. I've found that changing mindset shift towards more positive outlook can have a number of useful, beneficial effects in terms of sports performance or performance in working with teams and in meetings and negotiations. It's had a lot of impact on how I approach my relationships within my family. And so, under the general heading of positive psychology, there's a couple of, subtopics that Martin Seligman talks about here that lead directly into my takeaways. So first was the idea of moving away from just happiness. So positive psychology got a lot of criticism for being equated with denial of reality or denial of the negative aspects of reality. The idea of being an ostrich and hiding your head in the sand, putting spin on things or sugarcoating, and that's really not what Seligman is talking about in his book Flourish. So he expands on the idea of happiness because he felt like that was an insufficient term. So he offers the acronym PERMA, which stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And so that's a wider, more robust definition for the aim of positive psychology, and he scoops those terms all into the idea of well-being. So instead of aiming at happiness, he's aiming at well-being, and he goes on to specify each of those 5 elements, show how it can be measured, show how different psychological experiments have been set up in order to measure that and measure the effects that some of his interventions that he talks about later in the book influence each of those elements or some combination of those elements. So my big takeaway was that there's very good data-driven empirical approach to understanding this idea of well-being. And we can talk about positive psychology in a way that allows us a fair amount of detail, and as long as we're bringing an appropriate analytical mindset, we can be very precise in how we talk about these elements of positive psychology. That's not to say that what you find on most of the internet is going to automatically do that as well, but within the confines of the book Flourish, I think you get as much detail as you want, especially if you use the endnotes and you look up the studies that it refers to. He makes it easy to do so. So I feel like 2 takeaways here. One, this idea of well-being is a lot more robust and interesting than the idea of just happiness. And second, you can have a high-level analytical discussion about the elements of positive psychology. So that's pretty cool. He goes on to separate optimism from things like positive mood. And for me, it resonated as this idea of faith in the possibility of a positive outcome. So it's a shift in attitude from everything is going to work out for the best, which is, I guess, the baggage that I've been carrying for at least the last 30 years, and why I've been described as cynical, because that doesn't resonate with me, that things will always turn out for the best. I don't think they'll do that by themselves. But he more narrowly defines optimism basically as faith in the possibility of a positive outcome. So it's going to require work on my part, it's going to require attention on my part, but if I go into a tough situation with this belief that I can find the best possible outcome, then it dramatically increases my likelihood of finding that outcome or finding an outcome that's similar. In any case, it definitely worked out better for people than going in with the opposite attitude, which is nothing I do matters, right? If you contrast optimism as I have the possibility of finding the best possible outcome within this tough situation. If you contrast that with the idea of like nothing I do matters, that attitude leads to consistently more negative outcomes in a variety of experiments. So that was an interesting sub takeaway for me. The next interesting takeaway was just a deeper link to social connectivity. So this idea of relationships being important to well-being is something that's kind of kept in the background for a lot of the other aspects of self-improvement and positive psychology literature that I've read through. But Seligman takes an interesting look at how just having relationships that work leads to better performance on tasks. And so it's not to say that there's definitive literature out there on this, but he's digging deeper in that direction towards having an analytical understanding of how social connectivity leads to better outcomes. The next takeaway for me was an appropriate bounding for worst case scenario thinking. So for me, coming from a background as a first responder where I was responding to calls that required my law enforcement skills or my medical skills or my search and rescue skills, I was often asked to enter rough situations where people were having a bad day, either being in a fight or breaking some kind of law or destroying something, or something of theirs was destroyed, or a friend or relative was lost or hurt or needed to be evacuated from someplace. So suboptimal situations. So entering maybe not worst case scenarios, but pretty close in some instances, and then trying to find the best possible outcome within that worst case scenario. So things can always be worse. That's an interesting attitude to be bringing into a reading of this book on positive psychology. And so Seligman does a great job of setting boundaries around worst case scenario thinking. And I'm pretty good at coming up with worst case scenarios and how we can make them a little bit worse, or how they could be worse, and then work to bring them back in towards a more positive outcome. So I have that experience from my career, and then to look at it through this lens of, okay, you've got this optimistic attitude where, okay, with work and attention, I can find the best of the possible outcomes that exist in this scenario, versus like, an asteroid could hit and we could all die and there's nothing we can do to stop it, right? Like that line of thinking just isn't practical within the bounds of, say, a search and rescue mission, because we have no ability to affect like me personally, I have no ability to affect asteroids. So he asks us to pull in the boundaries of worst case scenarios. Sure, an asteroid could hit, but there's nothing we can do about it. So if we think about like what's the more likely situation, and we can extend that out to less likely situations that we can still influence and try to come back from and be prepared for those worse scenarios, but not immediately jump to, oh, there's an asteroid coming and we're all going to die, right? So he sets up appropriate bounds for worst case scenario thinking, such that we have more traction in what we do next and the decisions that we're making. So it keeps positive psychology practical and keeps it from devolving into some of the sugarcoating aspect or the opposite end, just gloom and doom nihilism, for lack of a better term. Next, character development. So he talks about ways that we can use elements of positive psychology to get more traction in our lives. So he goes through the idea of optimism in detail. He goes through how a gratitude practice can help you be a more effective human being. He goes through a kindness practice to help build more effective relationships. And he goes through some elements of grit and how we can basically be more conscientious, more hardworking, more enduring of tough situations in order to essentially become better at sacrificing our comfort right now for a long-term benefit that's a little farther out. So those are my takeaways. Connections here, really interesting series of connections. So I see a lot of connections with self-improvement literature that's already out there, and the main benefit is if you've been asked to take on a practice that will improve your optimism or your gratitude or your kindness or your grit, it's worth reading Flourish so that you can understand the mechanics of why that change can take place for you. At least if you're a questioner like me, and we'll get to this when I review the book, The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. But for me, I need to have a link to, like, you're telling me to do this, okay, why? What's the mechanism to make that work in the way that you want it to work for me? And so if I can understand why, I'm much more likely to commit to it. And so if you're like that and you want to incorporate one of these elements of positive psychology into your life to increase your grit, your optimism, your gratitude, or your kindness, then I'd say read Flourish so that you can get more traction with the change that you want to make practically in your life. Because he gives a great set of studies for each of the elements and each of the exercises that he offers. Another area where this connects in is with the idea of meaning. So in reading works of like Viktor Frankl and Jordan Peterson and Simon Sinek, where they're trying to understand how we sense meaning in our lives and how that connects to what we do and who we surround ourselves with, then Flourish is going to help with that as well. I think he helps draw some of the mechanisms of connection, interpersonal connection and connection of oneself with one's purpose, and how we experience meaning in our lives. So hopefully this review is helpful for you. I think anyone who's either a skeptic of positive psychology or maybe has had some bad experiences with positive psychology would benefit from this, as well as the questioners like myself who really need to understand why something works before we can fully commit to it. Also, if you're just curious about positive psychology in general and you want to understand some of the experiments that have been done to learn more about it, and more about some of these recommendations like gratitude practices and some of the psychological effects like priming. If you're interested in psychology, I think you'll enjoy Flourish by Martin Seligman. As always, you can leave comments in the comments section here on YouTube. You can hop over to our Mighty Networks. So it's scots-shelf.mn.co, and the link is in the comments or in the description below. So feel free to head over there. And I've got more discussion questions and some more resources on that Mighty Network. Thanks.